Hello and welcome to Friendship Focus. My name is Errin Stegich. I'm a local historian here in the Detroit metro area. And today we are honored to have our guest, Ken Cauvet, who's going to share his story with us about his experiences in the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. So, Ken, tell us about where you were born.
Well, I was born in Yonkers, New York, and I lived most of my teenage years in a little town called Ardsley, about 2,000 people. We went to a school that wasn't big enough to have a football team, so that gives you some idea.
Relatively small.
And we grew up without TV and without electronics and all these good things that people have now, but I managed to survive. After I graduated from high school, I went to Union College in Schenectady, New York, to study industrial administration, basically accounting. And when I left there, I was in the Air Force ROTC for a couple of years. And the Air Force and I did not see eye to eye very well, so I left it. And in my senior year, I was given a draft notice to go for the Korean draft in New York City. And that scared me.
Rightly so.
And we ran back to Albany and found the first recruiter, and that happened to be the U.S. Navy. So at that point, I signed up for the Navy. Was sent to Newport, Rhode Island, to the officer candidate school there, and graduated from there. And was then sent to a ship that was going to be on the DEW line watching for Soviet airplanes coming into the coast. Turns out the ship was a converted Liberty ship. If you remember, in World War II, these were ships that were built to go one time across the ocean, right, and they were going to sink. Well, that's what I was on. And not only that, but they put a big 50-foot radar antenna on the top of this thing, so it made it a little top heavy. And we could make a maximum speed of 10 knots, which isn't very much.
No,
we could walk faster than we could travel.
Right.
But I stayed on there for a couple of years as an air controller, watching for Soviet airplanes coming into the coast. We never did find any. And finally left there and went to Washington, D.C., where I worked in the Polaris program, office called Special Activities Office. Worked there for a couple of years in planning for the Polaris submarine program. And then I left there and I was sent to a destroyer, USS Charles S. Sperry, which was out in Newport, Rhode Island. We were sent down to Mayport, Florida in 1963, I think it would be, 62, 63. And while I was on there, we had this emergency notification to get underway immediately. Nobody knew why. So we gathered all the crew on a less than 24-hour notice, got the ship underway, loaded our food and supplies and munitions, and traveled down towards Cuba.
And you had no idea what was going on?
No idea at that point. So fortunately, after we were underway, we heard that the Russians were shipping some additional missiles into Cuba and that we were going to be part of a blockade.
And you say blockade?
Blockade meaning we were going to stop all the ships coming into Cuba.
Okay. And
we were assigned a stretch between Cuba and Haiti to monitor that part. As most people know, Russia did have missiles aboard some freighters that were coming into Cuba. While we were down there, our sonar crew came up and said, hey, we've got a submarine.
A Soviet submarine.
Well, we didn't know at this time, it was just a submarine.
Right.
And so we stayed with that thing for a couple of days. And he finally ran out of air or fuel and had to surface. And when this thing came to the surface, there was a green algae all over the outside. So they had been underway for a long time. Once he was surfaced, the submarine was turned over to another more exotic ship than the Sperry was. Interestingly, one of the weapons that they were talking about using, incidentally, we'd never used any depth charges, although we had them aboard. But one of the weapons that they talked about using was going to be a brand new weapon which was fired like a depth charge. That is, it went off the stern, the back end of the ship, sunk down, and when it got close to the submarine, it broke apart, and it consisted of a number of smaller units that were magnetized. And each of those units, the idea was that each of those units would glom onto the hull of the submarine, and as the submarine moved through the water, there would be a hammer-like action that would continuously bang on the hull of the submarine. The idea was psychologically it would drive the crew crazy.
Yes.
And fortunately, we never fired it, because had we done that, we probably would have been hit with a torpedo or something.
But did you have any idea that this was part of a larger?
Yeah, when we got down there, we
instance?
did, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we knew it was big. Most of the action was done by the newer ships, the ships that had political connections, if there was any name with anything associated with Kennedy. And as you recall from history, it was the bigger ships that actually intercepted the freighters with the missiles. And the missiles, Khrushchev did turn them back. So that ended that. One of the other things we did on there, while we were over on the Mediterranean on a short cruise, I don't know whether people realize this or not, but the Russians had a number of fishing trawlers off our coast. It would be a big fleet of ships. And it was discovered that at least one of those ships carried heavy electronic gear. And they were listening to our electronic communications along the coast.
Intercepting them?
Intercepting them, and then they would take them back, and similar to what our organization does, try to read them and find out what was going on. While we were over in the Mediterranean, we were assigned to follow one of these trawlers by himself. Here's this little fishing trawler and this big destroyer following each other along the Mediterranean until he finally went into Russian territory, and then we broke loose. So that was our Cuban Missile.
That's your Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's
not the larger one that
No,
most
that's
people
ours.
associate with Kennedy and Khrushchev.
Yeah, fortunately, it came to a happy ending. So.
How close did you actually know the world was at that time to what we would call nuclear Armageddon?
I don't think we knew. We knew there were missiles in Cuba. We knew the ramifications of those missiles, but we didn't have the instant communications that people have today. We didn't have the if something happens today, it's instantaneously broadcast over everything. We didn't have that. So I think we knew that there was a problem. I don't think anybody realized how close we really came to World War III.
Declassified documents indicate that these Soviet Foxtrot NATO classification subs were actually carrying 15 kiloton nuclear warheads on them.
Yeah, right.
So
it was close. It was very
close.
Yeah. And fortunately, Khrushchev backed off. And so after that, I went to Navy Intelligence School. And in the process, after I finished that, I was sent to out of Washington, D.C., and I had just met my wife and then fiance. And I was given orders to go to an LST, a large LST in Japan, was home ported in Japan. We were not married, and I told my wife if we were going to see each other again, we needed to get married right away, which we did. And then we traveled across country and flew over to Yokosuka, Japan. The LST that I was on had just broached in Tuiwa. Now let me explain what that is. An LST normally heads directly into the beach, so you could say they were perpendicular to the beach. And then the bow doors open and they can offload all their equipment and so on. Well, in this case, there was an unknown current, and so the LST actually went parallel to the coast, and once it was in that position, it couldn't get away. So it stayed there for 4 days. That was bad, but they were carrying Korean Marines
For 4 days.
for 4 days. And this was at towards the early part of the Vietnam War. Marines didn't particularly like American food. They didn't know how to use our bathrooms. And so all of them broke out these little cooking pots all over the ship to cook their rice and whatever they wanted to eat. So here's Ken Cauvet going aboard this ship as an executive officer while the ship is listing, that is tilting to the side, being towed back to Yokosuka. It's a mess.
I can imagine after 4 days.
Yeah. So we were in a Japanese shipyard for a couple of days. While I was on that LST, we had some really interesting assignments. We traveled the Mekong River from Vung Tau up to Saigon. It was at a time when they had just sprayed the jungle with Agent Orange, so all of vegetation was gone. We were in full battle gear. We had the guns manned for this 4-hour trip up the river to Saigon. And Saigon at that time was a really beautiful city. The peasants hadn't started moving into the city yet. All the activities were still there. You could still go into a restaurant without having somebody throw a bomb in or something like that. So it was quite an experience. We also carried a lot of marine equipment from Yokosuka. And by equipment, I mean everything from tanks to amphibious vehicles to lumber to bathroom equipment, you name it, we had it aboard.
Everything that you
ship,
need to supply yourself.
And we would travel from Yokosuka down past Taiwan mostly into a town called Chu Lai. And to make the landing at Chu Lai, you came up a little bit up a river, which had a really strong current, and you made this typical landing of going directly into the beach. And as you go into the beach, you have to drop an anchor off the stern end to keep the ship from broaching.
Right.
Which we managed to do most of the time.
Most of the time.
Because it was really hairy. And then we would offload all the marine stuff, and then we'd go back to Yokosuka and pick
And
up.
this is your first impression of Vietnam?
That was my first impression of Vietnam. All I saw on that first impression, the first time there, I saw Saigon, which, as I said, was a beautiful city. Most of the people in Saigon either rode mopeds if they were fairly well off, but most of them rode bicycles. They were all the women all dressed in these beautiful dresses. The black market was in full gear. With all kinds of American stuff for sale. In fact, you could probably buy more in the black market in Saigon than you could in the Navy exchanges at that point.
So that's convenient,
Yeah.
relatively.
So then I went back to Washington, D.C. And I taught at the Defense Intelligence School. And then they said, you're going to Vietnam. And I said, wait a minute, I've already been there. I've probably spent more time in country than the average person. Didn't count, wasn't on the record. So I was sent back.
Is this after the Gulf of Tonkin?
This is after the Gulf of Tonkin.
Okay.
So now the buildup is occurring. And I was sent first to Saigon again, but this time I worked for Commander Navy Forces Vietnam, and I was in N2, which is in the intelligence section. So we gathered all the intelligence that was coming in from different sources, analyzed it, and put the word out to the Navy forces there, mostly consisting of the river boats that you've heard about so much, and the various coastal Navy organizations. So I was there for 6 months, and at that time I saw Saigon start the buildup because people from the countryside were moving into the city because they couldn't live out there anymore.
Right.
The garbage was everywhere. I mean, it was a tremendous difference between what I saw on the LST and this time back. Things are really going downhill. When I went to Vietnam, I was absolutely convinced that we had a right to be there. We were containing communism, as I think that was Dulles that
Yes, John
had
Foster Dulles.
the wall of containment.
Yes.
We were part of that. We were dependent on some of the natural resources, rubber and so on, from that area, and we needed it for national interest. While I was there, I saw a lot of corruption, and I saw a lot of political leaders involved in corruption who were taking money and bribes and whatever else. My gut feeling at that time was that the peasants, those that worked the rice fields and so on, really did not support the South Vietnamese government.
Under GM.
Under GM. Either were apolitical or they were more interested in the Viet Cong coming in. So our forces always had this problem of if there was an attack and they went into the area where the attack was, the Viet Cong would just become peasants working their rice fields and so on. So
And
it was,
just assimilate themselves.
yeah, it would be hard to you weren't fighting against a force, a known army. Somewhat similar, I guess, to what the British found when they came here for the revolution.
Right.
We found ships, particularly one series of ships that were traveling up and down the coast, and we could track them into various cities. We knew that they were delivering weapons to the Viet
NLF,
Cong
right.
along